And after studying the esoteric literature, even just for a little bit, I realized that what we have been studying in the laboratory is exactly what people have called traditional magic. Divination is clairvoyance and precognition. Force of will is psychokinetic effects. Theurgy are phenomena like near-death experiences and mediumship. So because I was surprised at having spent almost 40 years studying these phenomena and not realizing that that is what traditional magic is about, I decided to write this book to express essentially what I discovered, which to other people might seem, well, of course that is the way it is. How did you not even know that? Part of it is because I went through the academic tradition, where we assume that a certain view of the world, and in that view of the world, ideas of traditional magic are laughable. It cannot be the case.
Actually, it turns out magical thinking is pretty powerful, because in the quantum realm, the realm of imagination is the king. That's the foundation for everything. Consciousness is primary.
A lot of people who are attracted to magic in the first place, they don't care how it works. They don't even care about the debate over whether it exists. They just want to use it. So the two simple forms that have been used as far back as we can see in history, one is called writing magic, and the other is called sigil magic. So these are very elementary practices, but both of them have persisted throughout history, probably because they do something. So from a psychological perspective, you can say, well, the act of writing down what you want, that will just psychologically predispose you to seeing that happening. But the question is whether it actually does cause the world to be different. So that's kind of what we study in the laboratory. Not so far these magical practices, but things like that, where you make very strong intention and then you see whether it changes something in the world. So in the popular sense, this notion is sometimes thought of as you create your own reality, that your ideas will manifest. That's where the idea of affirmations comes from, and to some extent positive psychology. You can trace that line of thought all the way back to shamanism. It is part of the esoteric tradition. So one of the reasons why I wish for a gold Mercedes and it doesn't show up is because we have lots of unconscious things that are working against us. We know that we have self-defeating behaviors. So you may consciously say, I'm not going to eat this cookie because it's not good for me, but you will find your hand going to get the cookie, and then it'll pick up the cookie and it'll bring it to your mouth and you will eat it. It's part of your unconscious that can override your conscious awareness. So this is one of the reasons why meditation as a practice is useful not only for mental and physical health, but is essential when it comes to things like magical practice. In the magical traditions, what a yogi might call samadhi, which is these very deep levels of mystical unity, a magician will call gnosis. And all of the magical traditions say that for magic to work, you have to do it from the level of gnosis. Well, most people don't go there. It's not easy to get there because the world is constantly pulling our attention away, but that's what's necessary.
So many of our illnesses and perhaps also our visions, our epiphanies, our intuitions, the good things that happen to us, come to us from that deeper mind, from that unconscious. And so to be in touch with that, to listen to its intimations, and then to interpret them intelligently so that the conscious mind can to some degree relate itself to it, translate it in a workable fashion into conscious life. This is the art of life. And this is what people have done as far back as we can trace them in history. They were already there. And this is what we need to do ourselves. Because when there is no adequate communication between that inner and the outer, then life is tremendously impoverished. And in turn, the more communication there is with that mysterious world, the more life is enriched.
Most academics, and this is now true everywhere in the world, are taught according to principles that have developed within Western science. That scientific worldview is based on a philosophical set of assumptions known as materialism. So materialism, in a nutshell, means that everything is made out of matter and energy, including mind. including consciousness, including everything we know about subjectivity. That's the prevailing view. So if you're challenging that view, you have the same problem that you would in any domain where you start challenging the status quo. The status quo doesn't like to be challenged, so it will push hard against anything that challenges it and attempt to squash it. This is the problem of materialism. Materialism doesn't know what to do with consciousness, so it sort of sets it aside. We'll worry about that later. Or it comes up with the idea that somehow the brain is complex enough that it gives rise to experience, even though nobody has any idea how that could possibly be. And we know that materialism is pretty good because it gives us the technology to do this sort of an interview with a special machine that captures my image and so on. So we don't want to throw materialism away. It's too good. The question is it good enough to account for everything? And here's where we have the problem. Clearly, it is not accounting for all of the experiences that people talk about. So what's missing? When you look at the esoteric traditions, you immediately bump up against what might be thought of as proto-science. So alchemy, astrology, and herbalism. Alchemy was the forerunner of chemistry, astrology is the forerunner of astronomy to some extent, and herbalism is the forerunner of pharmaceuticals. What's interesting is that historically, that all three of those proto-sciences also had a fourth element in it, the element of consciousness. So the practitioner of alchemy or the practitioner of astrology or herbalism knew that their intention was a very important component of what they were doing. This is true in each case. And yet science has stripped that out. You don't consider when you take a pill that your intention is important, except maybe as a placebo. But certainly when you're preparing something like metals or in chemistry, people don't think about that. But that was part of the original idea. And so I think what we're happening now is that science is slowly beginning to mature to the point where it sees that the intention and consciousness of the scientist is as important an ingredient as it was in alchemy and astrology and so on. So I looked in detail at the esoteric traditions, all the way back from shamanism to Pythagoras, Eastern traditions, all the way up to the present time. And you find that there's a similar thread of thought. And basically they're saying that a better model of reality is idealism, that everything is made out of mind, including matter. That solves at one stroke, if that method is correct, if that assumption is correct. It solves all of the puzzles about psychic phenomena and mysticism and all of that stuff. So now consciousness came here first. And so the challenge, the scientific challenge is how do we get from pure awareness to emerge into space and time and matter and energy? How do we do that? Well, there are lots of people working on that very problem. How do you emerge out of something that seems non-physical into physicality? Science is young. And we have far more things that we don't understand fundamentally at all than we do understand a little bit. And that's one of the fears that arises then. You say, well, I've spent my entire career as a professor professing certain ideas about the way things work, and you're coming to me and saying, actually, you didn't understand that at all. Well, that's frightening. I mean, no one wants to think that they don't know what's going on. So if somebody wants to live a comfortable life, the easiest thing to do is to go along with the flow, always. And if someone has a family and they have children to support and all that, it is actually the responsible thing for the sake of the rest of the family to not challenge the status quo.
One thing I've learned in the hard way in this field is some people just want to complain. Some people want to complain about the problem and don't actually want to resolve the problem. And we've all had friends or heard of somebody that they always seem to find themselves in the same type of scenario, the same type of issue, the same relationship, even though with 3 or 4 different people, it's the same story. It's like, look, you're always attracting people like this. Something is going on with you internally that you need to resolve in order to move on to the next level of life. But not everybody really wants to change. It's very possible, but you also must believe, have the faith that it's possible, and then just align yourself with the people out there that are also on the same wavelength, so to speak, and stay away from the people that are going to drag you down, you know. And we really need to dictate and decide up front how much time we are willing to put into those friendships or those partnerships or those people. And you have to think about that in advance. You can't just let it work out however it's going to work out, because it will suck up all of your energy, and you have to keep your energy intact and focus for what the things that are really most important to you.
What is the relationship of the brain to consciousness? Now, most scientists who follow the materialist reference frame will tell you that the brain makes consciousness the way a generator makes electricity. And they will give you examples of why they think that, because they'll say, look, if I were to damage a particular area of your brain, or if a particular area of your brain were unfortunately damaged in an accident, certain areas of your consciousness would blink out. They wouldn't be there anymore. They would also be damaged, and therefore it seems to be completely obvious that the brain makes consciousness. Let us remember that it was also for a very long time completely obvious that the sun revolved around the earth. And consider this. I mean, it does, you know, you get up and stand there at dawn, the sun goes up over there, comes across the sky, comes down there. Obviously it revolves around the earth. But there's another possibility, which is that the relationship of consciousness to the brain may be more like the relationship of the TV signal to the TV set. We have this 3 or 4 pounds of jelly inside our skulls, and it is definitely involved in consciousness in some extremely important way. If you damage the TV set, it is going to damage the picture that you get. But the signal is still there, completely intact, perfectly unharmed and unaffected by the damage done to the receiver. And actually this is the paradigm of all spiritual traditions, that we are non-physical consciousness which incarnates in matter. And that the suggestion then is that the brain may be a receiver or a transceiver of consciousness rather than a generator of consciousness. We have all the anecdotal evidence, and some of it not anecdotal. For example, Professor Ian Stevens' work at the University of Virginia on reincarnation. I mean, he went into reincarnation studies as a skeptic, determined to prove that it didn't happen. And he ended up, after 15 years of studying an enormous number of reincarnation cases, saying that the only rational explanation for his evidence was that reincarnation did happen. Then we have, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, some of which are absolutely intriguing, where the person appears to leave their body and sees things that they couldn't possibly see or know from the prone position.
What is very interesting is that the Western industrial civilization is the only group in the entire human history that doesn't hold non-ordinary states in great esteem and doesn't have any use for them, actually has pathologized them. Every other culture has spent a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to develop ways of inducing non-ordinary states. For many cultures, non-ordinary states represent really religious practice, spiritual practice. That is the religion that they have. I believe that Western psychiatry and psychology, they have a very inadequate, very superficial model of the psyche, and that the main reason is that we have systematically ignored the evidence that comes from the study of non-ordinary states. The tendency was to understand everything rationally in materialistic terms. And these other experiences then, that would take you into transrational domains, into the mystical, spiritual domains, were suddenly seen as kind of embarrassing leftovers of the Dark Ages that we have to get away from. And the experiences were relegated into the realm of psychopathology, something that ultimately will be understood in terms of brain pathology, or what we see in these primitive cultures. This is what savages do, something that we have outgrown as civilized people. Whether we talk about these states in the context of comparative religion, for example, in the context of anthropology, what happens in healing rituals or shamanic rituals, whether we talk about it in the context of the great spiritual traditions, yoga, Taoism, Christian mysticism, Tibetan Buddhism, or even in terms of some modern discoveries. We have tremendous amount of data generated from thanatology, the experiences of people who come close to death. And yet they have not been taken into consideration, they have not been assimilated in mainstream thinking. It's as if this whole area simply doesn't exist. I worked for a little over 2 years on this map, and when I finally had it together so that it covered all the major types of experiences that we see in non-ordinary states, it also dawned on me that this was not a new map at all, that this was a rediscovery and kind of modern reformulation of a map that in various variations, modifications, existed really not for centuries but possibly for millennia. This is what Aldous Huxley called perennial philosophy. And I saw the link to yoga, to Tibetan Buddhism, to Sufism, to Christian mysticism, the Kabbalah, I mean, you name it, shamanism. One extreme position is these are all psychotic phenomena, and the idea is that some kind of pathological process acts on the brain and it just comes up with this kind of phantasmagoria that really doesn't have any meaning, and these states are not worth studying, which is pretty much what has been done. Now, to me it's bizarre to try to explain these experiences by brain pathology. If we can look at a computer, I mean, if you damage a computer, all that you're going to get is a jangled program. I mean, I have been studying non-ordinary states for 37 years, almost daily. And so when I say something like this, I can back it in my own memory by hundreds of stunning observations where it was very, very unlikely that people could get access to this information. And then I'm in a position where I have to condense it in a couple of sentences and sort of shoot it at somebody. And of course it's implausible. I mean, it took me, years even having the experiences and seeing them daily in other people. And there's a very, very important domain where they are observed quite regularly, and that's thanatology, which is the science of dying, death and dying. And those are experiences where people simply leave their body and they can perceive the environment from some other angle, or they can even perceive something in remote locations. So there's now increasing number of observations of people who experienced a near death or clinical death experience, for example, on an operation table. And while the team is trying to resuscitate them, they have an experience of their consciousness separating from the body and kind of floating around and maybe precipitating near the ceiling. And then they are watching the scene with a kind of detached interest, so that when they come back to consciousness, they're able to exactly reconstruct what was happening as they saw it from the vantage point of view of the ceiling. It's possible for consciousness to go to another room of the building, or maybe even to a location which is 200 miles away, and give an accurate perception, something that can later be verified. And there are now indications that there might be possible for people who are congenitally blind for organic reasons to actually be able to optically perceive the environment under these circumstances, and then lose the ability to see when they reconnect with their body. So those are very easily verifiable experiences, and there's simply no way you could account for it in the traditional thinking, where consciousness is something that's produced by the brain, that's bound to the brain, because it shows that human consciousness can clearly function independently of the brain and retain all the perceptual qualities.
So how does neuropsychiatry help us understand people?
Yeah.
It's very good because you get both sides of the picture. You can understand what's going on in their brain, and you can understand what's going on in their minds. So you've got a really quite a close correlation between those two things. But it also directs you straight to the fundamental question of our time, and that is, what is consciousness? Is it all brain? Is it outside of brain? Because William James, way back at the turn of the century, said that consciousness was outside and the brain filtered it, as many people have done since then. Mm-hmm. Whereas others, and the main thrust of modern science is to ignore that and to say, no, it's all brain function. Mm-hmm. My own view is that's too limited. Mm-hmm. I don't think it is for a minute.
Yeah. How did you get involved with near-death experiences?
Near-death experiences I thought was rubbish, absolute rubbish. It only happened in California, and it would never ever cross the Atlantic. I knew that, and I said so. But
when was that?
Oh, that was way back in the late 1970s, just going into 1980. Until there turned up in my consulting room somebody who'd had a near-death experience. He'd had a cardiac catheter in one of our hospitals in London, which had gone wrong. And during the process, he left his body, watched the resuscitation, and then had a classical near-death experience. And so with this as an example, I was able to study them. And I came to the conclusion that they really happened, and they had a lot to teach us. So I had to shift my position from rubbish to really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that near-death experiences provide some kind of proof that consciousness can exist without a brain?
Can consciousness exist without a brain?
Yes.
Well, we'd have no way of knowing, would we? So the question is a good one. I'd formulate it slightly differently. I would say, are the mechanists right? Is consciousness secreted by the brain as the liver secretes bile, that sort of thing? Or is it a product of brain function? Or is it in fact a filter in some way? That there is in fact a transcendent reality out there that is filtered by the brain, so we get a reduced picture of it. And I think those are the two questions. I mean, I know what my answer is, but it's not the usual answer.
Why is that?
Why do I believe that consciousness exists beyond the brain rather than that it's secreted like bile in the brain? If you look at the arguments which are put forward, there's got to be a very high correlation between brain damage and the changes in the mind and in the capabilities and so on of the person who's damaged. There's got to be a very high correlation, but that doesn't say anything about causation, because causation and correlation are quite different. And if you want a really good authority for this statement, you can think about Penfield. Penfield was a very, very well-known neurosurgeon from Canada. And Penfield put electrodes in the brain. He's one of the first people to do it. Got a very good idea of how the brain functioned and how it was connected together and so on. So he spent his life actually looking at the brain. And at the end, he wrote a book about what did he think, what is mind. And he came to say There's absolutely no doubt that neurons communicate with each other in very complex ways, and complex ways we don't understand yet. But the energy of mind is different. And so however much you study the neurons, you will not in fact get to the energy of mind. So it's a different dimension altogether. Now that's from somebody who spent his life studying the brain. But of course I sit in between. The brain is enormously important, has great functions, but it can't explain consciousness. There is only one theory in this whole world of what consciousness is, and this is Stuart Hameroff's and Roger Penrose's theory. Now in 2000, when I started on this research, you could go into PubMed, one of the main medical databases, and ask questions like, how many people have published papers on deathbed visions? There are only about 5. What about end-of-life experiences? Maybe 1 or 2. And so you could become a world expert, you see, very quickly. You only had to look at 7 papers and you knew the literature. People who are paralyzed and haven't moved maybe for a year, been in a long-term care home, they can sit up and do it. So for those few moments, the central nervous system seems to work again appropriately. But more interesting than that to me is the people who have Alzheimer's disease and have in fact lost their memories many years back and just been in a care home, will sit up, recognize their friends, say goodbye, sometimes meet their dead relatives, and then lie back and die. We've got a lot of these and we've analyzed them, and they occur at the time of death. 99% are all within half an hour, most are at the actual time of death. And it depends on the mental state of the person who receives the visit. If you receive the visit and you're awake, then it will be a feeling that somebody you know is dying, the feeling that they would like some help in some way, or you feel some catastrophe is occurring. Those are the sorts of feelings you have. If, on the other hand, you're asleep, then it's quite different. You get a narrative dream, and here's an example of one. A woman woke up. I think she was actually in a narrative dream, and she saw standing at the end of the bed her son, and her son was dripping wet. And her son came closer and closer to her, and as he came closer, he came into the light and became transfigured. He gave her a message, which many of them do, and said, "It's okay, please don't worry, I'm all right." And then the whole thing faded. Now, the interesting point is that she's in Australia and he's in England. And when she can, when the time zones adjust, she rings up and she finds that, in fact, he was drowned at that time in England. And so there was a component of what was happening in that he had wet clothes, and then his transformation and disappearance at the end. So that's not an unusual story. Sometimes they just come and give their message, which is always, "I'm okay, please don't worry," and then move on. So those are called deathbed coincidences. Now, in our series of these, 45% of the people who had them didn't know the person was dying.
Many of my colleagues, many doctors would say these are just hallucinations. What do you say about that?
Well, this is terminology, isn't it? What is a hallucination? A hallucination is an experience that you have and nobody else does. So there are many hallucinations. So the fact that they're hallucinations really is saying nothing. But if you look at the data, then people, relatives in the same room, quite often, no, not quite often, rarely see the deathbed visitors, but they do see them. There are quite good accounts. Children see them more than adults, and occasionally the hospice nurses see them. So on that ground, they're not hallucinations in those cases. So why are you going to say some are hallucinations and some aren't? It doesn't make any sense. Calling them hallucinations mean that you're just keen to get rid of the topic. Now let's talk about something interesting. But they're not, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
I think the experience that I have learned about near-death experiences and dying have a very strong message to our culture. I'm absolutely with the Dalai Lama in the first part. And he says any culture which sweeps death under the carpet and can't acknowledge it is a society which is greedy, because you're collecting things and you're going to have it. You can be angry with people because it means it's fine to have enemies. And they are very self-centered. If you look at our culture, it's got strong components of that. So I think the way that we medicalize death, sweep it away, don't talk about it, is producing a culture that is exactly one in which we deny our responsibility.
Dr. Fenwick, thank you very much for your time and your interesting insights and the wisdom from your research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
The physicists are like the mafia of the science world. So here's a physicist, Lawrence Krauss, speaking about the universe. And he's very popular, Lawrence Krauss. So it's big, rare events happen all the time, including life, but that doesn't mean it's special. Well, how high do you draw the bar? You know, if the universe can make Lawrence Krauss from scratch, and all of us, build all of us from scratch essentially, and the web of life, then, and that doesn't mean it's a special universe, what kind of universe would be special? So that's a questionable hermeneutic, interpretation. Here's another one. This is Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. Was he going through a divorce or something when he read that? Or he ate some bad cheese or something. I don't know. But the last one there, allegedly said by nuclear physicist Ernest Rutherford, physics is the only real science, the rest are just stamp collecting. This leads to this idea of physics envy, that physicists are like, they like the giants of the science world, and they step on biologists, and they psychologists, you call psychology a science, we step on you, and ecologist, I step on 3 ecologists at once, So. But it's not all going to be comedy, by the way. But ironically, Ernest Rutherford he received a Nobel Prize for chemistry. So I bet you when he shook hands, he didn't say, "Oh yeah, I do good stamp collecting," So.
It's about one of your local heroes who is a great hero of mine, and I'm talking about Frederick V, Elector Palatine, Prince of Heidelberg, King of Bohemia, who was not content to sit back and let things happen, but was willing to launch a grand alchemical dream of a reformation of human society. Okay, this is a prophecy in the Hermetic literature. A day will come when men will no longer care for the earth, and at that day the gods will depart, and everything will be thrown into primal chaos. This prophecy was strongly in the minds of the strains of non-Christian thought that evolved at the centuries of closure of the Roman Empire. A world whose psychology was very much like the psychology of our own time, a psychology of despair and exhaustion. But this spirit is the spirit of life itself, the spirit of novelty itself, and it will not be suppressed for long in any time or place. So now again, it comes. It's a spirit of dissent that says we will not serve the values of materialism, the values of the ego, and the values that separate and break down the community. And this brings me then to the first factor, easily discerned by anybody who has their eyes open, that compromises and erodes the hopeless existential view of the world that we're getting from science. It's not a coincidence that electrons spinning around an atomic nucleus and planets going around a star and star clusters orbiting around the gravitational center of a galaxy. It's no coincidence that these systems exhibit the same kind of order on different scales. And yet science would say that is a coincidence. You know, P.W. Bridgman, who was a philosopher of science, defined a coincidence as what you have left over when you apply a bad theory. It means that, you know, you've overlooked something, and what jumps out at you as a coincidence is actually a set of relationships whose casuistry is whose relationships to each other are simply hidden from you.
Everything is the Light. An interview with Nikola Tesla. Numbers and equations are signs that mark the music of the spheres. If Einstein had heard these sounds, he would not create the theory of relativity. These sounds are the messages to the mind that life has meaning, that the universe exists in perfect harmony, and its beauty the cause and effect of creation. No, I have nothing against Mr. Einstein. He is a kind person and has done many good things, some of which will become part of the music. I will write to him and try to explain that the ether exists, and that particles are not what keep the universe in harmony.
The question is from a stage magician, and the question is, what is the nature of magic, or what is magic, or the wonder that it invokes? There are two theories. I mean, magic is not a trivial issue at all. There are two theories about how the world works, and each one depends on a fundamental assumption about what the world is. There's the scientific theory, which says the world is tiny packets of matter squealing along through empty space at close to the speed of light and subject to a certain set of interlocking laws. That's what science tells us the world is. Another theory is, and to my mind, a much more appealing and even intuitively correct theory, is the world is language. and the world is composed of description. Now, in the era before science, scientists like to say people were more epistemologically naive. What they mean by that is they didn't have a clear understanding of the division between the inside and the outside, between what we imagine and what actually is. But if you live long enough, I think you discover what we imagine and what actually is are very close to the same thing. The mind is somehow a co-creator in the process of reality through acts of language. And language is very, very mysterious. I mean, it is true magic. Human beings are co-partners with deity in the project of being. This is the basis of all magic. You see, in a Christian context, magic is heresy because it implies that man can command God to act. In other words, that in some strange way, the magician compels nature to behave as the magician desires. In Hermeticism, it isn't so much put in terms of compel, but the idea is that humanity, human beings, men and women of great spiritual accomplishment are co-partners in the project of being, and that God, as it were, stepped off the stage of creation with it only 90% completed, and the rest is left in the hands of his brother. The Hermetica actually refers to humanity as the brother of God. So it's a completely different attitude toward being human. It's an empowering attitude. I mean, if you take even the trivial belief about alchemists, that they were concerned with changing lead into gold. And of course, that isn't what it was about, but there were plenty of con artists running around on the periphery of these deeper scenes who were claiming they could change lead into gold. Well, in the 20th century, we routinely change lead to gold. You do it with neutron bombardment in particle accelerators. And of course, it costs far more to do it than the worth of the gold that you get out. But that really wasn't the point, was it? It was to prove that it could be done. Giordano Bruno and his school, he was a Franciscan monk who ended up being burned at the stake. His sin for which he was burned at the stake was he was sitting on a rooftop of one of these Italian city-states one evening, presumably smoking some pretty decent boo that they'd brought in from North Africa, and he was looking at the stars, and it occurred to him, these things are suns. These little points of light are like the sun. Jesus Christ! And in a single moment, the universe became infinite. And he said, if these are suns, and he just, his mind was boggled. I mean, can you imagine inside the medieval worldview where they have these concentric shells of angels and demons and all this? Suddenly this guy gets it in a single moment, and he sees that the universe is infinite, and he begins to say so. And he's burned at the stake for a point of view which all of us take quite for granted.